Vaya. We finished the second chapter last week, but I thought we would go over the last few verses one more time, and so I want to start with verse 70 of chapter 2, which is page 134 in my book. I guess as a warm-up, as an introduction, there's a bunch of stuff which has happened in the second chapter of the Gita. In a lot of ways, it's introduced the entirety of the text. So you guys can think about, a lot of you, we've studied the whole second chapter together now. You guys can think about what points you would bring up if somebody asked you to explain the second chapter, and specifically how the second chapter introduces the entirety of the Gita in a synopsized form, or what were the most important thematic elements of the second chapter, what's the flow of the second chapter, what happens in the second chapter. So to ask you that kind of question, how would you answer? And if you can't answer that, and you can't answer it definitively, and we study the whole chapter together, you have a learning problem. And I think learning problems, for the most part, do not boil down to some sort of fundamental intellectual disability. I think for the most part, learning problems boil down to a lack of focus and a lack of paying attention, and a lack of paying attention with the understanding that you're going to have to represent the information. I think if you listen to something carefully with the understanding that you're going to have to represent the information, most people, I don't know, 8 out of 10, will at least pick up the core thematic elements, and they'll be able to do something to represent, to present again, to represent the information. So this could be a pop quiz, but I'm not going to do a pop quiz, but it could be. And the pop quiz would then be, did you study the whole chapter with me? Those of you who did, you'd answer yes. And I'd call on you and say, what were the major thematic elements of the chapter? How did the chapter flow? And if you're doubtful as to whether or not you can do that, there's whether or not you can recount, I don't know, and get 4 out of 5 of the major elements, then you weren't paying attention. The other option is you're fundamentally flawed and you have a large intellectual disability, but I just don't believe that. And so my usual go-to is that's not the problem. The problem is you weren't listening, or you weren't listening with the idea that you're going to have to represent this and you have to therefore learn it. And anytime you ever learn anything, you should learn it from the point of view I'm going to have to represent it, because if you do that, you'll actually learn the subject. Otherwise, you'll listen to a lecture and somebody go, what'd you think? How did it flow? And then you'll say, oh, I really like the point you made about, two birds are sitting in a tree from the Upanishads, and that one of the birds is the witness and the other bird is eating the fruits to point out how God sits with us in our hearts but doesn't engage in the material world the same way we do. I really like that analogy. You'll pick out just one little thing. I really liked when you said the word love is a noun as well as a verb, and the feeling love comes from the act of love, and you can recreate love. I really like that point. You'll end up with little vignettes, small little tidbits of the class, but you won't actually be able to see how the whole thing is strung together. Now, of course, if you have a teacher who is not a systematic thinker, if you have a teacher who just rambles and maybe has a lot of knowledge but hasn't sorted through that knowledge and learned how to teach it, and the teacher just spastically says different things and there is no thread of continuity between them, then you have a problem. Because how are you going to pick up on the thread when there isn't one? But with a given, you have a teacher that has a systematic and comprehensive understanding of the subject at hand, then you should be able to, after listening to a class, you should be able to walk through the major points of the class. How many of you, when you hear a class, can walk through all the major points of the class afterwards? Raise your hand. Not, we haven't had class today yet, so I'm not asking about this class. I'm asking as a general, honest self-assessment. How many of you listen to a class and you can recount the flow of the class afterwards? Dhameshwar thinks he can. I'm more doubtful of that. But he's probably the best of the entire crowd. But I'm doubtful about it because you tend to put your own spin on things enough that you miss the actual speaker's flow because you're too in your own head with your own ideas, and it creates a knowledge filter, and so everything you hear is not received properly because you have such a strong mind, and you end up adulterating and obfuscating things with your own spin, which does work if you're smarter than your teacher. But if you're not smarter than your teacher, then you end up not picking up what they're trying to put down. If your teacher is inept, for lack of a better term, then sometimes you have to do that. You have to take your own framework and superimpose that on what they're teaching. But if your teacher is adept as opposed to inept, then the best thing you can generally do is empty your mind, but not so empty that you don't pay attention to the structure. Essentially, you have a working premise. There is a thread of continuity which ties everything together which is being taught. My job is to discover that thread of continuity and remember it. Did you guys follow that? I anticipated that you would be the only one to raise your hand. And I thought of this critique as I asked the question. Because a good, anyway, if you get a good teacher, they're 3 or 4 steps ahead of you, like in a chess game. And you don't know where it came from, but they know all the questions you have because they've taught the subject so many times. They know the answers to all the questions even before you ask them. So, we are done with the second chapter. We spent 8 classes on the second chapter, maybe even 10. I moseyed through the chapter. I really didn't rush it. And although we moseyed through the chapter, I did make a point to throw structure down at you guys in every single class and to connect all the dots. Therefore, if you guys were listening properly, you should, at this point, be able to recount the entirety of the second chapter. You might miss a sub-thematic element or two. You might get a couple of things in the wrong order, but you should have the basic structure of the second chapter on lockdown. If you don't, you either have a learning disability or you have a problem with your learning. And the problem, as far as I can diagnose, is that you were not listening carefully. You were not paying attention because you're too in your own head. You only got little vignettes, which anybody can get, because if you pay attention for 5 minutes, you'll get a vignette. You space out for 10, then pay attention for another 5, you'll get another vignette. And that's usually what people give you as far as feedback goes. Oh, I like this point you made. And they take 1/50th of your class. And they say that's what they got. How many of you are guilty of doing that? Raise your hand. Yes, you're all guilty of doing that because you do that to me all the time. And I think, wow, you really didn't get it. Because you have an Instagram brain. You have some sort of fundamental ADHD, some toddler level lack of attention span, and you're not able to pay attention for more than a few moments at a time. And so you do pay attention for a few moments, you zone out, you pay attention again. Therefore, nobody really has a learning disability. You have a learning problem. And that learning problem is you're not paying attention. And if you want to add something to paying attention, you have to add a working premise, which is that there is a system to the knowledge being presented. And your job is to discover that system and just, it's almost like an operating question or an operating need. You are going to need to represent this as soon as class is over. Therefore, you have to understand it because somebody's going to ask you to represent it right afterwards. And if you learn to listen with that kind of focus, then the whole world will open up to you. You'll be able to understand people when you talk to them. You'll be able to understand a book when you read it. You'll be able to follow along with somebody's life story. When they get spastic, you'll be able to question them surgically in a way that helps them to structure their own thoughts about the world and helps them to better understand themselves. You'll be able to really dive into somebody's world and understand deeply the way they look at the world, what they're trying to communicate, what's important to them, what their value system is. And so it opens the door for a much richer life where you're able to engage with people and appreciate the fascinating and wonderful world that they live in, and you become way more educated, way more well-rounded, way deeper. And it's the most loving thing you can do is to pay attention to somebody when they talk. Krishna speaking. The Gita is really a conversation. And he just spoke for a solid 70 verses. It would have taken, 15 minutes? Maybe less, maybe 10. It was a significant monologue. Arjuna did jump in a couple of times, the beginning and the middle of the chapter. But for the most part, Krishna's been speaking 90% of the second chapter. So, what was taught? Well, Arjuna had a nervous breakdown and a panic attack. Krishna chided him, mocked him, called him impotent, called him weak, mocked him to foment Arjuna's existential crisis, to get Arjuna to a point where he realized he didn't have an answer. That happened at the beginning of the chapter. Then Arjuna had a meltdown, so to speak. And sometimes that happens. You got to just push somebody along. There's short focus therapy where you just try to help somebody within 1 or 2 therapeutic sessions. A whole bunch of techniques for this. One of them, one of my favorites. It's a big club. You got to wield it carefully. If you don't know what you're doing, you make mistakes and you end up screwing the person up, pushing them over a cliff. But if you know what you're doing, it's a very, very powerful technique. When somebody comes to you and they're whining and they are feeling sorry for themselves and they're playing the victim, you roll with it. And you're like, yeah, you are a loser. You really don't have anything going for you. You really don't bring too much to the table. You really do deserve all the bad stuff that's happening to you. And you just hit them with what they're telling you, because they're telling you that with the idea that you're going to rush to their rescue and tell them all the good things about themselves. It gets in this codependent little tango, and you got to get out of that. So one of the things you can do is you just roll with it and insult them. Then what happens, if you do it right, what happens is they get angry at you. And they start sticking up for themselves. And then you sort of let them win the argument, but you don't give in right off the bat. You kind of go, are you sure? Are you sure you're not a loser? Are you sure you got some stuff going for you? And then they go, yeah, I got some stuff going for me. Like what? What do you got going for? I got this, and I got this. And you go, all right, okay, all right. And that's a way of getting them You ever use this technique? No. I've used this on many people in this room. It works. It's in a certain context when somebody's feeling sorry for themselves, they're wallowing, and you got to get them out of that wallow. Otherwise, it's going to turn into this just kind of ineffective, you're good. I have faith in you. You can do it. It turns into that, but there's not really much benefit in that. So if you try that with people and they end up just coming back to you to wallow every time, then sometimes you throw this at them as a curveball and it wakes them up. Krishna did that to Arjuna. Arjuna then broke. He said, all right, I need some help. And then Krishna taught him two things. Number one, he taught him that you are not the body. In fact, you're a spirit soul. You are consciousness. And that's a earth-shattering revelation. It changes the world in which you live. Big picture stuff. Cure for myopia in all of its iterations. Second thing Krishna taught was what to do now that you understand that. So he gave him a theory and a practice. He gave him a hypothesis and then an experiment. He gave him a book knowledge and street knowledge. He gave him an idea and then what to do with that idea. He gave him a why and a how. It's a very systematic way of presenting things. You give an idea, a dangerous idea, and then you flesh out how that idea is going to change your life. And so you're not the body, that's called Sankhya. It's philosophical. And what to do with it is called yoga or buddhi yoga. And the word buddhi in buddhi yoga means enlightened yoga. Yoga here means action. Yoga karmasu kaushalam, Krishna says at one point. Yoga is skill in work, the art of work. Prabhupada's expert translation. Yoga is the art of work. Karmasu in karma. Yoga karmasu kaushala. Kaushala means skill, art, ability. Yoga is the art of how to work in this world without being of this world. Yoga is to do your duty without being attached to the results. And that's buddhi yoga. The buddhi, is the enlightenment, is the idea that you're not the body, which then changes the way you live your life. How does it change the way you live your life? You do your duty, but you're not attached to the results because you know that ultimately you are aloof from this world. There's something bigger going on. There's something more important going on. Ultimately, you get the idea of doing your duty without being attached to the results, even as an atheist. Because there are always variables you can't control for. Therefore, to do your duty and be attached to the result, first of all, what are you going to do? So, duty now is introduced as like the best thing you can do. As long as you got to do something, you might as well do your duty. The greatest good for the greatest number of people. Instead of just sort of hedonic, utilitarian selfishness of just trying to make yourself happy, trying to give yourself pleasure. You give pleasure to others. You minimize the suffering of others. That's the idea of duty. Something bigger than yourself. And then you could get to that as an atheist. You see how systematically I think? I say it's a spiritual idea which leads to this, but you could also get there as an atheist without the spiritual idea that you're not the body. You could just simply realize that I can't control the outcome because there's too many variables for me to account for. We okay? There's too many variables for me to account for. Naika? Okay. There's too many variables for me to account for. Therefore, I can't control the outcome. Like I'm giving a great class, but you guys, like a bunch of dogs, just look over as soon as someone walks in the room. You're like, look at that. Totally break the focus of the class. I can't control that. You guys have a lack of ability to concentrate. When I'm listening to a class and something happens, I don't break my focus. I look at my teacher. I don't break my focus. Because I'm a good student. And so I take it real seriously. You ever watch me in a class? I pay full attention. I don't break my attention. And that's even if I'm managing the space. Well, to speak of not managing the space, then I'm just like glued. So I can't control whether you guys are going to pay attention or not. I can just make sure I give a good class. You do your duty, you can't control the results. You could figure out that I can't control the results without ever believing in anything higher. Which could then lead you to the idea of I can just do my duty. That's all I can do. I should be detached from the results. So there's sort of two ideas at work behind doing your duty and not being attached to the results. One is that duty is what you should be doing with your time. And then number two is that you should be detached while doing your duty. And you could get there either by just passionately looking at the world and realizing I can't control things, or if you have a higher spiritual value system, that's powerful because now you realize I'm a soul in a body. I'm not of this world. There's something bigger going on. Therefore, I shouldn't get too wrapped up in this world because this world isn't me. It's two different ways of getting detached. And they can, of course, work jointly. I can't control the world, and there's something deeper going on. Those two things together are like a very powerful combination. One of them necessitates a belief in something spiritual. This one. I'm not the body. Therefore, don't be attached because there's something bigger going on. The other one, I can't control what's going to happen, therefore be detached because I'm not in charge of what's going to happen. And that you could get to even as an atheist. Anyway, Krishna doesn't go that route. He goes the spiritual, philosophical idea route. Then he gets the idea that you should do your duty, not be attached to the results. Nervous breakdown, you're not the body, do your duty, don't be attached to the results. And I fleshed out how those two ideas go together nicely, but how you could potentially kind of get there even without it. Then Arjuna says, hey, tell me about this self-realized yogi. I want to know how they move in this world, how they interact with the world, because I want to flesh this out so I have something for me to shoot for me to aim for in my own life, so I can recognize a good teacher, so I know if I'm going off the path, so I know if I'm doing it right. Like, you're teaching me how to do a handstand. What's a sign I'm doing it right? What's a sign that I'm getting what you're trying to teach me? Should I be able to do a handstand right away? No, but you should be able to come off the wall for like 5-10 seconds at a time. You should be able to jump up with no wall and hold it for 3 to 5 seconds. Oh, now you're holding it for 5? Now walk a little bit. It's okay, you can walk. Kind of get that balance. We'll dial it in where you don't walk anymore in a minute. And so somebody, if they know what class A of the arm balance class is supposed to look like, what Sunday's class on arm balance is supposed to look like, what we're supposed to be able to figure out by Wednesday, what's supposed to look like next Saturday, that's very, very useful for someone who's actually serious about learning how to do a handstand. So Arjuna asks functionally the same question. What does this person look like? It lets him know what he should be shooting for. It also lets him know what he should be looking for in other people, maybe who are going to be his inspirations, and so on. Gives Krishna a chance to further flesh it out. And then Krishna answers that question and gives a lot more detail, which gets us to where we are now. And he's wrapping things up. So what's the chapter? Fomentation, and short focus therapy. And then you're not the body, segueing into do your duty but don't be attached to the results, segues into give me a little more so I can better understand what I'm supposed to shoot for and who I should look for. Those are the major features of the chapter. You can go into more detail. You can go into some segues Krishna has when he's arguing that your consciousness and not the body, and how he anticipates a number of counter-arguments and troubleshoots them. You can go through those arguments, which includes some atheist arguments. You can hit that little sidebar where Krishna talks about that, you're a warrior, therefore you should do your duty and not worry so much about whether you live or die, and how that detachedness of a warrior doing his duty then turns into the yoga question. You can see how Arjuna's question was, what are his symptoms? How does he walk? How does he sit? How does he talk? Which are the specifics of his questions, and then what Krishna's answers are to each of those individual questions. But if we were to just do the rough, bare bones minimum, everybody who was even paying attention, like 25%, with this proper mindset, you should have been able to get nervous breakdown, you're not the body, do your duty, don't touch the results, and what does that look like? How many of you would have been able to get there? Honestly. How many, if I'd asked you, put you on the hot seat, would you have been able to say at least that? Raise your hand. Honestly. You could have done it.
It would have been a little patchy.
Huh?
It would have been a little patchy.
Okay. All right. I think you would have got there. I personally think you would have got there. Because I think you know the second chapter anyway. Now, you might not have valued the things the way I did. I gave the really big ideas in the chapter. And I dropped anything which wasn't big. If it didn't get like a good solid 10 verses, It didn't get a mention. Nervous breakdown, you're not the body, yoga, and like, what does that look like? If it didn't get a full 10 verses, it didn't make my list. So this is, and I also gave you guys I gave you a little bit more minutia. Who could have done that? That's a problem. You guys have a learning problem. I don't think you have a learning disability. I think you have a learning problem, and the cure for your learning problem is to A, focus, and B, have a working premise that I have to teach this, and my teacher knows what he's talking about, and I have to figure out what the flow is. And of course, we have two teachers here. You have yours truly, but you've also got Krishna. Krishna is a systematic teacher. Because I'm teaching the book, I automatically become a systematic teacher because I'm teaching a systematic book and I'm doing a good job of it. So therefore, I have a structure of what I'm teaching automatically. Of course, I don't even order dinner without a systematic thought process that goes into it. I mean, it's just the way I function in the world. So you guys are kind of blessed because if you want to learn how to systematically look at stuff, it's kind of my thing. It's kind of my thing. And Krishna's a super systematic thinker. If you don't bring this working premise, I have to teach this. There is a thread of continuity which ties all this together. I have to figure out what it is. And when I finish this class, I have to know what's being taught. If you don't bring that working premise to the class, along with the ability to focus on what's being said, you're going to have problems. If you do bring those two things to the equation, what are the two things? Dalen, number one? Problem. Number one? Focus. See how simple it is? The ability to focus. No, the exercised focus. Because you have the ability to focus and not deploy it. Focus. Number two. What's number two? No, not number two is you're not the body in the class I'm teaching. That's not what I'm saying. What's number two? The working premise. And the working premise has two parts. What are the two parts of the working premise? Dom.
There's an inner thread that
That's number one. Second part.
you're going to have to represent.
Cha-ching. Boom. See that? Focus. Working premise. Working premise, though, has two parts. Two parts are, there is a thread, and I got to discover it because I got to teach it as soon as class is over. If you bring that to the equation, when you're learning something systematic, you will skyrocket in your ability to learn it. If you bring this to every conversation you have with every person on the planet, you will skyrocket in your ability to understand people. You'll understand them better than they understand themselves. Because when they lack structure, you'll be able to give them structure, which will help them to find their voice. You'll meet somebody who is a spaz. Raise your hand if you're a spaz. That's right, you are all spazzes. You will meet an unsystematic thinker who just vomits their way through life. And you will gift them structure. You will listen to them carefully, looking for the structure, and they'll have disparate ideas. And you go, well, wait a second, how do we move from here to here? And they'll be like, oh, and then they'll start to connect the dots, and those disparate, non sequitur ideas that they tell everybody in the world, by you systematizing the way you listen to them and surgically involving yourself, you'll actually help them find their voice, because ultimately everybody makes sense, even if they need a little help to get there, unless they're schizophrenic. Schizophrenic people you can't do this with. Everybody else you can. Because schizophrenic people live in a world which is non sequitur unless you are in their brain with them. And you can't be, because consciousness is a private matter. And even with the best ability to empathize, their world is almost like non-Euclidean. It doesn't follow the regular geometry of consciousness. And so it's like, what is 2 plus 2? And they're like, purple! and then you're like, then you figure out that weird world where 2 plus 2 equals purple. But then they switch. And it's like, what is 2 plus 2? Fuzzy. And you're just like, and you can never get your bearings because there's these ever-shifting sands. And by the time you manage to get a foothold in their unusual world of math, they've moved on to another unusual world of math. Right? Isn't it? Unless you're dealing with a schizophrenic, anybody else on the planet, even if they don't make sense to themselves and they're rambling their way through life, by listening carefully with this idea that there is a thread of continuity, you'll discover and you'll actually help them find their voice, and you'll be able to better understand them, and you'll be a friend to them. What to speak of if you encounter systematic thinkers, how deep you'll be able to go. You guys follow this? So we're just wrapping up. We're wrapping up. Krishna's answered this question about this self-realized soul and what he looks like, and we're just getting the finishing flourishes on that last part of the chapter. And text 70 says, Apuryamanam achala pratishtam samudram apa pravishanti yadvat. You guys see it? Yadvat. Just as samudram apa vishanti, just as apa, water, vishanti, enters into samudram, the ocean. But the ocean is achala pratishtam. It's unmoving. It's situated in a state of being unmoving. Apuryamanam, even though it's becoming more and more filled at every moment. Just as the ocean is fixed, although always being filled, as waters are entering into it. Fixed not in the sense that there's no waves, or there's no low and high tide, or there's no actual water exchange, but fixed in the sense that there's no real disturbance substantial to the ocean. I mean, we're by the ocean here. High tide comes in, the ocean goes up a little bit, low tide comes in, the ocean is down a little bit. Basically, the ocean stays in its banks, stays in its shores for millennia. It's not just wildly going on and coming up and wildly, it's not like some sort of roaring rapids. That's the river. Dries up completely. Flash flood. The ocean's just too big. It's too settled. That flash flood in Laguna Beach where the whole canyon floods doesn't even make a dent in the ocean. You follow? Nor does peeing in the water. You know? I mean, we're really having to work hard to pollute the ocean. Urine's not going to do it. We got to throw nuclear waste in the ocean to make it happen, And we're really doing everything in our power to destroy our ocean with these 10-mile wide flotillas of plastic garbage in the Pacific. And we're really putting our best effort into it for quite a long period of time. But as a general analogy, the ocean does represent this dynamic phenomenon which possesses a tremendous amount of stability despite being a dynamic phenomenon. It has things entering into it. It has things being taken away from it. But it enjoys a tremendous amount of stability in this ever-changing world. Did you guys follow that? Dynamic system with an incredible degree of fortitude and stability. Tadvat, in the same way, kama yam pravishanti sarve sa shantim apnoti na kama kami. Tadvat kama yam pravishanti sarve. In the same way, that person for whom yam kama pravishanti sarve, all these different desires are entering into that person. But they're not being disturbed. That's the analogy. But they're not being disturbed by it. That's the implication of the analogy. The analogy stops there. In the same way, for the person for whom all the desires enter in, but this is implied. It's not stated. The verse is expecting you to have the intelligence to be able to fill in the blank. So just as the ocean is always filled, always being filled, but is remaining more or less stable in this dynamic situation, it has an incredible degree of stability. So similarly, in the same way, yadvat tadvat, in the same way, for the person who all the desires are entering into them, but, finish the sentence. But they're not acting on the desires. They're not getting swept away by the desires. You get it? Now there was another analogy that was given about a boat, where one of these desires can just act as a strong wind and just knock your boat off course. But now the proper example of what we should aspire to be like the ocean, which can accommodate all sorts of wind and all sorts of water, like really heavy changes, but still stay stable. Sashantim apnoti. That person, he or she, attains peace. Nakamakami. Not the person who desires their desires. Not the person who gets wrapped up in their desires, who desires their desires. It's one thing to have desires. It's another thing to get wrapped up in your desires. You follow? For that person who gets, see what you guys did? You guys focused. You saw that? Because I chastised you previously. And so now everybody's on. Now everybody's focused. Had I not chastised you previously, everybody would have been doing this like whole rubberneck thing. But because I got everybody's case, everybody paid attention. And now you're easy to teach. Not the person who desires their desire. Nakamakami. Not the person who's filled with a desire to enjoy their desires. Who gets wrapped up in their desires. Who just gets totally knocked off center by their desires. If you get knocked off center by your desires, you'll never achieve anything of value in life. Sorry. But it's kind of a boilerplate, bare bones, minimum requirement of achieving something great in life is that you can at least delay gratification in order to focus on the task at hand. She's up in the ante, right? We didn't pay attention. She walked by. Now it's like, pretty soon she'll be doing a jig in here, right? Not the person who desires their desire. You need to learn to delay gratification and focus on the task at hand. If you don't have that, develop that ability, you lack impulse control, you lack executive function, and you're not going to attain much. Everybody needs to learn how to pay attention to what's in front of them, what's important, put one foot in front of the other, delay gratification, not get dissuaded in order to do something worthwhile in life. When you meet people, close that door for me. When you meet people who are just always get completely wrapped up in, like, they meet a new guy or a new girl and they're just a train wreck and they're just up and down and just spastic and they're just like madly in love, and then they're like over it and they want to be a brahmachari, a monk for the rest of their life, and they're madly in love again, and they just have they use drugs and they give them up and they use them again, and they're your best friend and they hate your guts and you're your best friend again. What do you do with people like that? What do you do with people like that? Yeah?
You can't trust them that much if you're that close to them because...
You keep them at arm's length. You can't trust them. Hey, you, outside mommy. Take the baby out. See if Riley wants to hang out with the baby. The whole thing is about the baby. She wants to hang out with the baby. So go take her outside. See if Riley wants to watch her. You can't trust such a person. They're like, I'm going to be a vegan for life. I ate a hamburger yesterday. I'm going to be sober for life. I ate oxycodone yesterday. Right? I'm going to be celibate. I'm like sleeping with like 3 new people. I'm in love. I hate them. I'm up. I'm down. I'm all over the place. What do you do with people like that? They're like a train wreck. You've got to keep them at arm's length because they're just going to ruin anything they get close to. Isn't it? This is an amazing verse because it anticipates the reality that the world is in a constant state of flux and that good and bad things happen at all times, and that you are going to have desires and you have to learn how to manage those desires and have some executive function. It's not this sort of Zen idea that you just have no desires or they just go away. It's not this platitudinal version of reality that nobody can identify with. This is real. It anticipates and acknowledges the extremely complicated situation in which we find ourselves in this world, with competing desires and intense pushings in different directions, and tells you, yeah, you still got to stay the course. And that itself is a road to self-realization, a road to peace, a road to happiness. Maybe not a road to enjoyment, but a road to a higher level of enjoyment. Enjoyment's overrated. Happiness is underrated. And somehow people think happiness and enjoyment are synonymous, when in fact the two things couldn't be further from one another. And maybe they are linked in some capacity, but there has to be a lower happiness and a higher happiness then, or a lower enjoyment and a higher enjoyment, because sensual enjoyment is not profound happiness. Profound happiness that lasts for life is not to be found in sensual pursuits. Profound enjoyment that lasts for life is to be found in deeper conversations about ultimate value, the purpose of life, spirit, God, etc. Things that represent unchanging principles that you can anchor yourself to and thereby stay strong through the maelstrom of life. So the verse is amazing. It doesn't just represent an absolute fixed point. It's an ocean. It's not like a pier, which is sunken in the ground and doesn't move no matter what the ocean throws at it. You follow? It's not that. It's not a tree, which just, a singular tree, which just develops roots going straight down. It's a tree in a forest which develops roots which connect it to the other trees through a network where one tree becomes many trees, and that tree is much more stable. An ocean which enjoys a tremendous amount of stability in a constant state of flux. It's a brilliant analogy. It's a brilliant simile which Krishna is invoking. I actually have a hard time thinking of a more brilliant analogy which communicates stability within a dynamic system. And this is great for us because it is something that you can pretty much strive for today. Okay, I can't stop desires. I can't stop pushings. I can't stop those things. But I can not let those things run my life. Do you know what happens if you have a pernicious, obsessive thought and you ignore it? You know what happens? It goes away. It leaves you alone. If you get some little obsessive thought and you just chillax and take some deep breaths and keep doing what you're doing and show a little bit of fortitude and stability, the thought will leave you alone. It might get worse temporarily for 5 seconds, and if you're that much of a wimp that as soon as it gets a little rough, you cave, then you're going to think, oh, this gets worse and worse. It just gets worse. Actually, it's not true. It doesn't just get worse and worse. It gets worse for a half a minute until you just show some fortitude that you're going to pay attention to the task at hand, and then, lo and behold, you can control your thoughts, control your desires, not identify with them, figure out what your duty is, stay the course, become a person of substance. And all of a sudden your mind's your friend. And you don't suffer these, I don't know, mad, bull-like desires that just rip apart the barn of your consciousness. Rather, you're like an ocean. A bunch of rivers go into the ocean, and the ocean stays chill. There's an incredible power that comes from learning how to watch your thoughts. Seeing your thoughts for what they are. Thoughts. Not absolute impetuses to force you to act. That's why they're called thoughts. You follow? Even in psychology, you have covert action and overt action. Overt action is actual action that you take in this world. Covert action is the stuff going on in your head. They're two different things. One thing doesn't always lead to another. Some people lack the ability to control their actions. And if they have a thought, they have to pursue it. Like I wasn't watching this show, but on Netflix, if you scroll over something, it shows you like the first minute of it. So it was about killers. Somehow there's this like weird thing where everybody wants to interview a serial killer or a murderer and then watch it and then have trouble sleeping and they can't figure out why they're depressed, but they're associating with criminals on death row. So this was a show about people on death row. So it was a woman and she's like, yeah, I went in the kitchen to get a pack of cigarettes and I thought, I should just kill him right now. So I grabbed a pistol instead and went and shot him while he was sleeping on the couch. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going to watch this show. I almost didn't watch that 10 seconds. It was like I barely kept it together to watch that 10 seconds as I scrolled over. But my wife and I looked at each other and we're like, nope. Next. But when you meet a person who just does whatever they think, that person's super dangerous. I don't want that person anywhere near my life, anywhere near my family, anywhere near me. You lack executive function. It's like a critical feature of antisocial personality disorder. It's in many ways the designing feature of the dangerous, criminal, antisocial personality type. That and a lack of conscience. However, a lack of conscience by itself is not so much of a problem. That's the sociopath next door. That's not so dangerous. But when you meet somebody who has no executive function, even if they're not lacking empathy, they can get angry in a moment and snap, pull the trigger. Even just from a modern psychology point of view, a lack of ability to distinguish between thoughts and action, and the idea that these two things are inexorably linked, and a thought necessitates an action, that makes you dangerous. But the truth is, a thought is just a thought. Like I tell people all the time, you're engaged now, and being engaged is not equivalent to being married. Otherwise, it would be called being married. You follow? It's not the same. Once you're married, you're married. While you're engaged, you're warming up to getting married, but you're not married, because when you get married, then we call you something different, which is you're married. Similarly, a thought is kind of moving in the direction of an action, but you got a lot of free reign there to deal with your thoughts and desires. Decide the kind of thoughts and desires you're going to act on. Becoming sober, if you've been a drug addict, requires mastering this subject. No one gives up using drugs and just never thinks about using them. Gives up being alcoholic and never thinks about drinking. Gives up bad relationships and never thinks about pursuing them. It just doesn't work like that. There's this winding down phase where you're having to learn how to white knuckle it a bit and how to deal with unwanted desires and thoughts that don't serve you. Analyze them, talk about them in a therapeutic way, ignore them, let them pass, focus on the task at hand, and so on and so forth, rinse and repeat. And then over time, things chill. And then you're on to new heights, new challenges, new dragons to slay. This is progressive life. And so what I find so nice about this, beautiful about this, is Krishna is giving us a really powerful interim level of self-realization where you're able to exercise a significant amount of control in your life. You deserve credit for that. And that is itself a type of peace, which then leads more and more to deeper and deeper levels of peace, where those desires ultimately stop bugging you, and the mind, which was your greatest enemy, becomes your best friend, because you can use your mind as the tool it was meant to be instead of having it use you. So this verse, I think, is brilliant. It's a brilliant analogy. And it's this contrast between the boat getting swept away on the ocean by a wind, and then the ocean itself being incredibly stable. It really, don't be a little boat, be an ocean, right? Sometimes you say about it, they're an ocean, right? Like an ocean of whatever the good quality is, you know? I mean, it's just vast and deep and profound. So we even use this. But the particular way Krishna's using this analogy, I personally think it's brilliant. And it's really an intermediate stage of self-realization that everybody should be aspiring for today. Then you can set your sight on something even deeper. A person who's given up all desires for sense gratification, who lives free from desires, who's given up all sense of proprietorship and is devoid of false ego, he alone can attain real peace. This is interesting because it's almost like another level. I mentioned this intermediate level. This almost sounds a bit like the next level. Hear it again. Vihaya kaman yat sarvan, a person who gives up all desires. Pumangs, a human who does that, a person who does that. Charati nispriha, and moves in this world, acts in this world, nispriha, devoid of passion, devoid of excitement, devoid of being titillated, devoid of being lusty, devoid of being greedy. Spriha indicates kind of like unbounded. It even sounds like that. Spriha. It sounds like it's like all kind of like springing up. And so it's this sort of desire. But you're nispriha. Nispriha. You are free from moving in the world according to that. But then nirmama, you're not possessive. Nirmama literally means not mine. And then also you are near ahankar. Ahankar is an interesting word in Sanskrit. It's the basic word for false ego, which of course implies there's real ego. The real ego is your spirit soul. The false ego is your anything other than the spirit soul. I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm young, I'm old, I'm a human being, I'm this, I'm that. That's all false ego, because ultimately the soul is devoid of all those designations. It exists, but it exists as consciousness, not as a body. It exists beyond the body. It may be in a body, but it's not of the body. It's not derivative of the body. So near ahankar. Ahankar is the basic Sanskrit word for false ego. Again, contrasted to real ego. Real ego is who you actually are. Who are you actually? I'm a spirit soul. Who are you not? I'm not anything else. Ahankar literally means I do. Ahamkar, I do. So if you think I'm doing things in this world, I'm of this world, I'm attached to this world, that is false ego. You're identifying with things of this world instead of identifying with yourself as a soul. Nirmama, you don't think anything belongs to you. So you don't think stuff belongs to you, you're not possessive, And you also don't think that you are inexorably linked to this world. Rather, you're living in this world but not of it. You're like a lotus which is in the water but dry. This sounds like a higher level than the last one. It could be seen as another way of describing the person, but I see an evolution from a lower level where the desires aren't messing you up to where you're eventually free from those desires altogether, and you've given up the major manifestations of desire in this world, which is greed and possessiveness, and which is egotistic action. These are two really key, fundamental ways in which Indic philosophy identifies the major strains of material engagement. You try to possess things, and you think you're of this world in any capacity. I'm a king. I'm a god. I'm powerful. I'm weak. I'm up. I'm down. I'm rich. I'm poor. I'm fat. I'm thin. I'm a man. I'm a woman. I'm a human. I'm a plant. We identify with this world that tethers us to this world unnecessarily. You free yourself from this idea that it all depends on me. I'm the doer. And you free yourself from possessing it. This belongs to me. And you operate in this world nispriya, without desire. And that person, sashantim adhigachati. He gets peace. She gets peace. Again, we read these verses last week as well. That is the way of spiritual and godly life, after attaining which a man is not bewildered. If one is thus situated, even at the hour of death, one can enter into the kingdom of God. Esha brahmistita parta. This is the spiritual situation. This is you as a soul. What? This way of living in the world. You're in the world, but you're not of it. You're moving in the world, but you're not of it. Nainam prapya vimuhyati. And attaining this, na muhyati. You're never bewildered. If you can get here, you're never going to be bewildered. You're never going to get overwhelmed by your senses. You've reached a stage of stability within this dynamic world where you're not going to fall. Stitva asyam antakale api. And being situated in this way, having become situated, stitva is the past participle, having become situated in this way, even at the time of death. Brahma nirvana mrichati. You attain Brahma nirvana, which is just this brilliant compound term. Brahma is a standard term in Sanskrit. Brahma, a standard Sanskrit term from bri, which means to grow. It's a term used for God, for sacred text, for a spiritual level of realization. That's why it says Brahmi stiti. It's a spiritual situation. So in that case, the word Brahmi is being used to mean spiritual. It's a spiritual situation. Here the term Brahma nirvana richati, you attain Brahman. So Brahman means God, it means soul, it means spirit. But it's a positive term, which indicates growth. Brahman is that thing that kind of like grows without limit. And then nirvana is also a Sanskrit term which means extinguishes. Va means wind, va means to blow, and nirva is negative, so it means to blow out. So nirvana is a Sanskrit term borrowed by the Buddhists from the Sanskrit language, because Buddhism arose out of Hinduism as a schismatic movement. Buddha was born in India, built on Hinduism and critiqued it, and that became Buddhism. His critique of Hinduism was Buddhism, but while borrowing many concepts. And so this Brahma Nirvana Richati puts these two things together, a positive attainment of spiritual realization, and then a giving up of the negative aspect, a letting go of what you're not and attaining what you are. I'm not the body, I am a spirit soul. I'm not of this world, I am pure consciousness. I'm not possessive, but I do have attachment to spiritual things. Thank you very much, IGTV.